Hello all. My topic for this week is clergy misconduct, or more specifically, Unitarian Universalist clergy managerial misconduct towards religious education professionals. So before I start going through things, I wanted to just acknowledge that this is some tough stuff. Potentially, it might be triggering for those who have experienced misconduct at the hand of Unitarian Universalist religious professionals or other religious professionals. Those who have been affected in communities affected by misconduct, and those who have experienced misconduct or abuse in other settings. So I invite you to engage and disengage as makes sense for you. I also want to remind everybody to take care of yourselves. In the idea of taking care of ourselves, I decided to put these pictures of this quilt art that Peg did of Unitarian Universalist chalices throughout this presentation as a way to ground myself in the beauty and power of Unitarian Universalism, in addition to some of the uglier or more destructive sides that we're going to take a look at. So first I want to cover what is clergy misconduct. The simplest definition is misconduct is when ministers abuse their power. Now, clergy misconduct is a term that's broader than just Unitarian Universalism, so that minister's word might be different in other contexts. Almost exclusively, when this term, clergy misconduct, is used, it's used in the context of sexual misconduct towards a congregant. However, for this week, I invite us to broaden the potential meaning of that word to include the abuse of power by ministers and other heads of staff and congregations towards other staff members. And specifically I'm thinking in hierarchies. In thinking about that topic, I want to acknowledge why the focus of my research was on liberal religious educators, so Unitarian Universalist religious educators specifically. As I mentioned, when the term clergy misconduct is used, it's used in the context of often of sexual misconduct. So most of the research is on that aspect of the topic. Of the research that's around staff relationships, a lot of that centers on unequal power dynamics, and almost all of that I could find centers on religious educators specifically. I think that's because religious educators are sort of the group with the second most power in Unitarian Universalist professional religious groups, and the first group is ministers. However, I want to acknowledge that I think a lot of the same dynamics that we might see between religious educators and ministers are probably happening as well to other Unitarian Universalist professional groups like musicians and administrators and membership professionals and custodians and other groups that don't necessarily have that same categorization. And that a lot of those groups don't have enough power to assert, right, that this is a problem. Finally, I wanted to also potentially broaden that term to look at expressions of white supremacy in our congregations, in my congregations, And when I think about what that would mean, right, this abuse of power in a white supremacy context, I think of everything from hanging a noose in somebody's office to supporting policies and leaders that support and enact the killing of black and brown people, to centering whiteness in a way that's inappropriate, right? So in that idea of there are multiple ways that abuses can be enacted, I wanted to share this power and control wheel. So this is a tool that was created in specifically domestic violence context to show that while we often think of violence and abuse as being about physical abuse or sexual abuse, there's actually a range of behaviors that are abusive. So some that I want to highlight are economic abuse, emotional abuse, minimizing, denying, and blaming, and male privilege. So with all of those ways of understanding misconduct, I think the next sort of question becomes, how widespread is the problem, right? How prevalent is this? To start to answer that question, I have a quote from Reforms Take Age at Clergy Misconduct, which was an article published in UU World and written by Kimberly French on December 1st of 2014. How widespread is the problem? There's no way to know. But the Reverend Deborah Pope Lance, whose research and consulting has focused on the impact of clergy misconduct on UU congregations for the past 30 years, believes most congregations have been affected by it. As many as 2/3 of our congregations have been served in living memory by a minister known to have engaged in sexual misconduct there or elsewhere, she said. At first, I said that timidly, because we can't imagine our ministers would do that. But now we know they can and have. So that's a lot, both numerically and as a thing to hold, right? In helping us sort of grapple with that, I have 3 things that I'd like to pull out. So the first is just numerically, what does that mean, right? So there are 1,082 Unitarian Universalist and Unitarian Universalist congregations. 2/3 of that number is 721. The second thing I want to note is that Reverend Deborah Pope Lance in this quote is specifically speaking to sexual misconduct. So if we're broadening our definition of misconduct, that potentially means that more congregations are affected. And the final thing that I want to pull out of this is this line at the beginning, there's no way to know. To help explain that, I have this quote from Reverend Deborah Pope Lance in her Berry Street lecture, which was given on June 22nd of 2001. She spoke, and then I read in the transcription here. You may wonder, as I have, how many of our congregations have been misconducted. No study has been done. So then I really felt the need to create this web to look at the interrelations of things and put all this stuff in context and sort of get it out of my head. So this is what I'm looking at, right? Clergy misconduct or clergy abuse of other religious professionals. I don't think that conversation about clergy misconduct can happen without understanding the intimate ways that it is connected to broader abusive structures in our culture. So when I think of broader abusive structures, I think of the domestic violence, interpersonal violence, sexual violence, right? Which we can see in the way that power and control wheel is so relevant to this discussion. I also think about broader abusive structures like white supremacy and other ways in which violence and abuse are enacted daily and in our society. So I think that we've seen the ways that connects to trauma through our trauma stewardship book. I also think those are intimately related, right, to systematic oppression. And I think that systematic oppression is related to and goes back and forth between the governance structures that exist. So in this topic that I'm talking about, I was specifically thinking about hierarchy and that as being a way of governing. And of course, those governance structures are present in our Unitarian Universalist specific systems. And I also think both of those are related to this idea of congregational autonomy. And in this topic specifically, I was thinking about congregational autonomy in the sense that one thing I was reading and hearing was that ministers don't have a clear, direct person who oversees them. So sometimes in congregations, the person who the minister is accountable to is the congregation. Sometimes it's the congregational board. The Unitarian Universalist Association, which is the national organization of Unitarian Universalists, sometimes has a role in that overseeing, specifically through the Ministerial Fellowship Committee. But I think it's not clear who to go to report or get help for a minister who is misconducting. I also think that alongside this conversation about the ways that power is abused and the way that power is used in ways that are violent and ways that are not what I would want to see, I think there's this conversation about other forms of using power and using powers in ways that I would want to see that I think is right alongside this conversation. So one topic that came up in that question is this idea of personal and community accountability. So that's the idea that I am responsible for my actions and need to take accountability for the way that I affect others, and also the way that my community and the people that I am in relationship with have a role to play, and I have a role to play in their accountability. Some tools to do that sort of accountability and responsibility work are covenant. Specifically, I think that covenant is a tool, a really powerful tool that exists in Unitarian Universalism, and I think that this tool is often not used to the extent which it could be. Another tool is this concept of shared ministry, and that idea is this idea that congregations are sometimes organized in ways that are hierarchical, but all of the paid staff in a congregation does ministry, right? So it's a way of looking at staff relationships in ways that are more collaborative and co-equal. So the final tool I want to talk about is this idea of restorative justice that I've heard as coming out of the prison abolition movement, so that's why I put that there. Restorative justice is sort of this response to the idea of punitive justice. So punitive justice is the idea that somebody does something bad and we need to punish them for that. This is the idea that our criminal justice system in the United States is built on. Restorative justice is another way of looking at what justice might look like and how it might be achieved, that looks at the needs of the person who was a victim or survivor of the bad thing, what the needs are of the person who did that bad thing, and what the needs are of the communities that both are a part of, and the ways that that bad thing has effects on all of those levels. So to explore this topic further this week, I have some resources for us. The first is this article, Abusers, Enablers, and Faculty Culture. So this is looking at abuse in PhD programs and other academic institutions. And I think the article does a really good job of highlighting the spectrum of abusive behaviors, specifically in that, like, there's a lot of little things that somebody can do that are in that range, even if they're not necessarily the worst thing ever. I also think the article does a good job of looking at complicity and the myriad of ways that we can be complicit. And then finally, I wanted to include it as another acknowledgement that this is not just a Unitarian Universalist problem. This is not just a religious problem, right? This is a systematic thing that is also present in Unitarian Universalist congregations. So the next resource I have is Places to Report, which is just a Word document I compiled of all of the people or institutions a victim or survivor of UU professional misconduct could go to for support or justice. One note I have is that this is not an editorialized list, so I wasn't trying to weigh which resource might be best for somebody to go to. I was just trying to list all of the places somebody could go. If you would like my opinion on any of these or all of these different resources, you can send me a private message or an email and we can have that discussion. So the next resource is Clergy Misconduct in the UUA, One Church's Experience. This is a web blog post that looks at a board whose minister, a Unitarian Universalist congregation board, who is trying to hold a minister who has misconducted accountable, and sort of the dynamics that happen in that process. The piece is a little dated. It was written in 1998, but I think a lot of the dynamics still feel really relevant to this discussion, and I think are still true today. So next resource is a 10-minute part of a video from the Laredo UUA Presidential Candidates Forum from last year. Specifically, this clip, or this section of the video, is a question, the second question in the forum, which was about power relations between religious educators and ministers. Also, as a note for this one of the three women who was in the forum was elected UUA president last June. So all three of them are important leaders in Unitarian Universalism, but Reverend Susan Frederick Gray is the one who ultimately was elected to become and is Unitarian Universalist Association president. The final resource is Laredo Questions to the UUA presidential candidates. So this is a series of questions that were written for the final forum before the UUA presidential election. And I think they really show the way the Laredo board was engaging these topics and how important power dynamics are. So finally, as a note, I wanted to say that this PowerPoint, that web that I made, the power and control wheel, the UU World article, where one of the quotes was from, the Berry Street lecture where the other quote was from in this presentation, will all be available at the bottom of our resources for this week. You do not need to read these. I'm not expecting you to read these resources. I just wanted to provide them in case you wanted to peruse them, specifically in case you wanted to look up the context for this quotes or something like that. So this is my Works Cited page. I want to pull out first Peg, who did all of the amazing quilted chalice art. I also really wanted to take this opportunity to thank James Forrest and Katie Resendez de Perez, who both had hours-long phone calls with me about this topic, and without whom I would not at all have been able to put this presentation or these sorts of resources together. And finally, to end, I wanted to read a prayer, which is written as a poem called "Having Been the Other" by Natalie Fenimore from the book Voices from the Margins. May what we know of suffering, redemption, and salvation bring us to love. Having been the other, may our hearts exclude no one. Having been the slave, may we long to be no one's master.